My name is Gabriel Florit, as the slide says, and I'm a journalist at the Boston Globe, and I do data visualization. And I really put together about 100 slides or so, hoping that I'll keep you entertained, and I'm going to talk about what I do. So let's start with a theme. I'm going to introduce, there'll be 3 themes I'll be talking about today. The first one is political speeches. So last year it was a presidential season, and we had 3 presidential debates. And so when the first one came along, I was not prepared for it. As a matter of fact, my boss told me that there was going to be one later that day, the same day. So it's what we call a daily at the newsroom, just you have that day to prepare. And so I had a couple hours. So I made this, a word cloud. I cannot remember where I don't remember where I got the algorithm to do this. It was my code, but I just pasted in the words from both debaters of the first debate, and this is what it created. I have to say that I think most, including myself, most database practitioners have an aversion to word clouds, but readers really like it. So I think that's something to keep in mind. Sometimes it can be a valid communication device. And so this was well received. So the next debate was in 19 days. And so, well, the third debate. I was also working on other things. I couldn't work on all debates. So I had targeted something for the third debate, and I had 19 days. I figured, let's experiment. Oh, so before I show you that, I've put together some videos that show every time I save my work, it takes a snapshot. And so it's a way to log what I'm doing. So this is what I tried. So you can see I'm already struggling with a lot of data, a lot of words. And some of them, like jobs. Presidents or presidential candidates like to say jobs and tax a lot. And so stop words was an issue. Do you know what stop words is? Yes. No, just in case, I'll explain it. Stop words is a fancy term for throwaway words that don't really mean anything, like the, and, is, of. And so each language has its own set of stop words that you can safely, I would say, disregard when doing text analysis. But the problem is like these. But the problem is and so I used this software, Natural Language Toolkit from Python, a Python framework that can filter stop words, which is great because at the beginning I started doing it manually. I was actually I kept a list, an array of, and I was actually sorting it alphabetically too, which was unnecessary, but it was fun. And so then I used an LTK to filter stop words, great, but in presidential debates, American, country, these are meaningless words. If you include them in your text analysis, then the presence of these words is going to be so large, it's going to make everything else insignificant, right? So then I switched to this algorithm, and this is as far as I'm going to go into text analysis because it's way over my head, like most things. TF-IDF is this algorithm that takes into account, assigns a value to each word based on how frequent and its frequency within the corpus. So it's a context-specific way of grading words, and so this is what I did. I used this algorithm to get rid of things like American and country. So good. So I did some more experimenting. So now I had this idea that I wanted to, each dot was going to be a word, and then these rings denote the speech length, and I was going to put these words depending on when they were said and the first letter of the word. And you can see green at there. That's because I was using the 2 colors, red and blue for the two parties, and then green because that's the moderator that speaks a lot at the beginning, and then of course Candy Crowley, and then she doesn't afterwards, not as much. And so I thought I was going to be ready for the third debate, but I wasn't, which is too bad. The third debate came and went, and I wasn't ready. So fortunately, I was able to put it aside because I knew that the inaugural address was going to be coming up pretty soon. And it was more of the same, just text analysis. So I repurposed the debate graphic and did this. So instead now I'm focusing on all the inaugural addresses that we have that have been recorded, which starts in 1933. And I say recorded because I needed to know when each word was said. So at the beginning you can see I'm doing a little bit of cleaning. I'm still deciding on what should I really use, jobs or tax. And now I start plugging in the various presidential speeches. And then the size of, you'll see it in a bit, the size of each overall circle is the length of the speech. Great, so that was the graphic I put together over a really intense weekend. And then a couple hours before launch, I decided to add a drop down up there because I wanted to, at this point, the only way for me to navigate between words was to hover over each of these dots, but I really wanted to explore in a more manual way. So I add this drop down, and then right away I see this. Like, who said bacteria? So I start exploring, and I find dynamo. Eisenhower in 1957, that makes sense, right? And then I figured, let's see who, I bet engineer, no, engineer. Obama is the only one that has said engineer, which to me is surprising because you figure that someone that was building bridges, you know, the interstate, all that would be engineering. But of course, and we know this after the fact, that he's the first one to mention gay. So I had spent 2-3 weeks, perhaps months, if you can't count and you add all the time that I had spent iterating on this idea. I spent all this time to come up with a super fancy thing, only for me to find that the most interesting discovery was when I just simply started looking at the words. And that's what I used them in this little bit of a text copy that I added to the beginning. You know, I used that discovery to mention dynamos or bacteria. George Bush likened cocaine to a deadly bacteria. To me, in this graphic, this bit of introductory text is almost as interesting as what comes after. Because, and I'll show you the graphic. So each of these words, as I was saying earlier, the screen is a bit small. So each of these words is each of these dots is a word. And so, for example, right now we're on Obama, and most presidents say freedom a lot, and they also say country. But he said equal. The darker the dots, the more frequent the word is, and then you can see when he said it. You can look at patterns that you would expect, like Bush. We know that he said freedom a lot, 20-something times. But then all presidents say freedom, right? Nixon said, what did he say? Responsibility. That's interesting. So this is something I learned and I still struggle with. As a coder, every time I come across a data set, I want to show you everything. I want to come up with a way, like a visual map of my data that is going to somehow brilliantly encode an infinite number of variables, right? Like here I had one variable for the frequency, for when it was said, that's 2. What else? The first letter of the alphabet of the word, which is totally meaningless. That's it. I really wanted so much more, and already I was showing you too much. I think that this is something I need to keep in mind. Showing all the data isn't always the best approach, especially for these exploratory type graphics. I think a strong guided intro at the beginning is really important. It's something that people call a tacit tutorial, a way to sort of guide you in. If you imagine that the graphic that I put together is like, I don't know, a huge library, if you will, and then you need someone to tell you, these are the books that you should read, but you can read them all. But these 2 or 3 are really, really good for what you're interested in. So, back to text analysis. 7 days later, Menino was going to give his 20th State of the City address. It was an important address because there was speculation that he wasn't going to be running anymore, which turned out to be true. So someone in the newsroom said, well, 7 days ago you made this thing. Why don't you just repeat what you did, more polar diagrams? And by polar diagrams, I mean the circles. To which I said, because I was bored of that, so let me try something else instead. I was liking the squares, and my boss told me, use circles, because squares are boring. And I will get to more on that in a second. So that's the graphic as it was published. And I won't go to it because it's exactly the same idea as before. You know, when you hover over one of these circles, you get the word in context. Woman was, it was something that his frequent mention of women was something that was talked about in the papers. And so, yeah, so when you hover, you can switch to different. But notice that this time I'm not showing you all the data. It seems that I've learned from my previous mistake, because this time I chose the 10, not the most frequent words, but 10 I think important words, and then just showing you how these frequencies change over time. And then I have to mention the use of circles. I think maybe you will have, I think Lynn, I was looking at the notes from a previous presentation. Lynn Cherney, I think, told you that you shouldn't use circles or squares to denote a number, because the eye has a really hard time understanding a measure when dealing with an area or an angle. And that was what I told my boss. No, I shouldn't do this. And he said, well, I do not believe in graphics orthodoxy, is what he said. And I really like that phrase of his, because it is true that you should know the rules and not break them all the time. But sometimes the purpose of a graphic is to pull you in. I think not to be underestimated. Like, yes, I think that this is not the best graphic if what you really want to do is to convey how many times these things were said. But when you look at the overall treatment, hopefully it pulls you in. It's like if you're walking down a hall and then you see a door, a room, the door is open and the room is shiny. There's something interesting there. You're not sure if it's worth your time, but it's interesting enough that it's akin to someone dragging you in. And then once you're inside, you might decide, I'm not interested in this, but at least something has taken you inside. And these sort of bells and whistles of graphics sometimes can provide that function. I wouldn't say that you should do that all the time, because because you shouldn't. Okay, so back to text analysis. So State of the Union is 12 days away, and this is a huge corpus. It is, I looked it up yesterday, it is over 1.8 million words. Before, initially they were given to orally, and then I think Jefferson, or one of the early ones, decided that to really enforce the separation of powers, he didn't want to be there in person, so he started writing them and handing them to Congress. And a number of presidents after him did the same. And so at one point, they were 300 pages, you know, something that you would never say aloud. But as a consequence, we have a lot of text, which to someone like me who loves data is like, oh my gosh, you know, I can do everything. But I had had enough of literal text analysis. I really was done. So with the help of my wife, actually she did most of the reading. We read dozens of addresses, at least one per decade. I figured I needed to choose at least one per decade to cover all of the 2 centuries. And I highlighted memorable and unusual quotes, things that I thought stood out. And once I had about 100 or so, I made this. A quiz, because if you remember, one of the more fun discoveries of the first iteration of text analysis was me exploring the data and finding interesting ways in which words were used, like bacteria or dynamo. And so I read the data, I became familiar with it, then I chose these quotes, and then the quiz looks like this. You're presented with 5 quotes at a time, and I'm going to guess, let's see. I don't know, I guess one of the early ones. I'm from Spain. I don't know American history very well. Hey, good. So, you know, you're given these questions, and you answer. And then, when you're done, hey, that did not bad. You get a little bit of a grade, and so the quiz gave you a score. It allowed sharing on Twitter and Facebook, which is more important than I thought. And the other thing that I did was I knew that I was going to give the reader a score. So. 5 out of 5, 4 out of 5, 1 out of 5, or 0 out of 5. And so for each of those scores, I went back and I found examples of presidents saying things that perhaps could be said to you. So if you scored perfectly, Calvin Coolidge will tell you, and this is an actual quote, "Mere intelligence, however, is not enough. Enlightenment must be accompanied by that moral power which is the product of the home and of rebellion." If you get a 4 out of 5, George Washington will say, "You will agree with me in opinion that there is nothing which can better deserve your patronage than the promotion of science and literature. Knowledge is in every country the surest basis of public happiness." At 3, "The spirit of improvement is abroad upon the earth. It stimulates the hearts and sharpens the faculties." If you do a C, Bill Clinton says, "Let me further say that I want to work with all of you on this. I realize this is a complicated issue, but we must address it." If you get 1 right, Jimmy Carter will tell you, "We must make a maximum effort, because if we do not aim for the best, we are very likely to achieve little." And if you fail entirely, Ronald Reagan, "I've painted a pretty grim picture, but I think I've painted it accurately. It is within our power to change this picture, and we can act with hope." So I spent a lot of time doing this, but not as much time as I had spent before, because there was very little coding here. It was just me reading the data, actually, reading the data in a way that I usually don't do. And sometimes there is no substitute for intimate familiarity with the data. A fellow newsroom developer for the New York Times says that sometimes he'll take a database that he's working on and just scroll to a random row, because do that long enough and you're going to find if the data is, if there are inconsistencies in the data, eventually you'll see something. And that's a good way, I think, to just at random go somewhere in your data, and is a good way to explore. So fast forward a few months. The first theme was political speeches, and I just showed you 4 examples of basically the same, 4 iterations on one idea. So now let's switch to 311 calls. Boston has a number, a 311 number. If you call, you can complain about something, like a pothole or the fence or what have you. And Menino has been well known for being the heaviest user of the 311. He would call all the time and say, this fence needs mending, and within hours, the Department of Public Works would be there. So this is a data set, and it's a great data set because the city of Boston makes it available publicly, and it goes back to 2007, I think, which is when it was instituted. So I figured, let me experiment and see what I can do with this. I really like this one. I like the satellite view. To me, it feels like I'm hovering above Boston somewhere, and I'm seeing all these people call, and each of those dots was a complaint in 2013, and you can see spikes. I can't remember if I was doing graffiti or rodent. It doesn't matter though, because I ended up not using that idea at all. And so this is what ran in the paper. Not in the paper, but on the digital version of the paper. Each of these dots is a complaint, and then you can zoom in to where you live. And I struggle with this a lot because haven't had the experience of having shown you too much. I wanted to do something that was a bit more guided, more interesting. And so I was going to either do something that just focusing on something like graffiti in Alston, or noise complaints in Harvard or something like that. But in the end, I decided that maybe the more interesting thing would be to focus on the reader, because as a reader, as a consumer of news myself, whenever I find a data set like this, the first thing I do is what's going on in my neighborhood. Whenever I find any map about anything, I'm going to zoom into Watertown, which is where I live, and what's going on there. So I figured that's maybe the use case for this. So if you live right there on Center Street on O'Donnell Terrace, you could hover over one of these dots and see what's happening. And this is what ran in the paper. A coworker did this, took the hexagons that you had seen previously, and then extruded them with this super cool 3D software that basically the taller one of these hexagons, the more complaints there are. It's another way of looking at the same data set. Of course, this is much more visually compelling than the previous one. So 3 days later, the last theme of the night, election maps. This was a particularly fun year for news people because elections always provide great material, amongst which is campaign finance. And the OCPF, Office of something, I forgot what it stands for. Compiles. Is in charge of receiving campaign finance numbers from the candidates who have to send, and every time they receive a donation of more than $50, the candidates have to send in the contributions to this watchdog organization, and then they take care of compiling all these numbers and then providing them to the public, which is a great service. And so this is the data. I scraped their site, and I had an idea. I wanted to explore campaign donations by geography. And if you did not live in Boston or you forgot already. Remember at one point we had something like 24 candidates. Then it went down to 12, and then this is what I tried. And so this is the graphic that ran in the paper. Each of these, it's a bit hard to see here, but each of these is a zip code. And you can see, for example, a Conley who lives in this area got a lot of money from his neighborhood. And a version of this also ran in the paper. So that ran September 6th. But there were 18 days until the preliminaries, so ample time for me to do something different. The nice thing about campaign donations is that every week there are new numbers, so you can always be. It's basically data that is always interesting up until the election. So on the previous graphic, if you notice, I had briefly explored mapping by census block. What I did previously was a zip code. And each of these, they're colored by, the coloring here doesn't mean anything, but each of these is a census block. And so there are 7,100 census blocks in Boston, which is a lot. And so I decided, let's do that. So this is the map that ran on the paper, not the paper, the website. And you can hover over each of these blocks, and for example, Arroyo, who you can see that he raised money here. And there's these annotations. I had learned when doing previous maps, I had realized that I really wanted to add annotations. An annotation makes something else to keep in mind. An annotation makes any graphic look interesting, and it's a great way another great way of pulling a reader in. When you add something like this, a bit of text, and just point at somewhere in the map. You know, I chose to highlight the fact that he lives in Jamaica Plain. I could have highlighted something else, but when you add things like that on maps or on graphics, that's a good thing. And so if, we switch to Barros, and you can see an annotation here. It highlights where he lives, that he works near here. He also owns a restaurant. Also, I was really particularly proud of this graphic because it's perhaps the first map ever to have responsive annotations. These bits of text magically move around as you make the screen bigger. That was a lot of work, unnecessary. Well, maybe it was necessary. So, perhaps the first map ever with responsive annotations. It launched September 24, and 4 days later, we had a preliminary. So finally, the election is here. And so my strategy was to keep the readers interested at all times, to have a graphic during voting, before the polls closed, another graphic after polls close, and before winners are announced, and then a final graphic after the winners are announced. And so during voting, I did this, which is a graphic that kept updating. We had turnout numbers that would come in 9 a.m., 12 p.m., 3 p.m., 6 p.m. And so the darker the neighborhood, more people have turned out. And this was especially interesting because people used this to speculate on who was going to win. And by the end of the day, the darkest areas were here. Well, this is actually the darkest. Well, 6 p.m. there's one more, but here and here. And that ended up being more or less telling because, well, Connolly lives down there and Walsh lives here. And those are the two candidates that went through to the final election. So After polls closed and before winners are announced, I did the usual, election treatment. It updates over time. And then after the winners are announced, I did this graphic, just another map. I was pretty sick of maps at this point. Another map that showed you all the candidates, and then it showed you how well they did. So, for example, these are all the precinct winners, and the darkest in black here is Walsh, and you can see that he won where he lives, and then Connolly down here. But then I also did this where you can either look at each individual precinct and see who won that precinct, or you could see each candidate. And this was interesting because people started, I saw people writing that before the final election, a couple of people wrote things like, I get a feeling that the more important, the people are going to decide this election is people of color because of et cetera. And I don't know, when I read that, it occurred to me, have you not seen the graphic that very clearly explains this? This area is Gola Ritchie won. She's the only woman and also black, and she won this area also with Barrows, who is Cape Verdean. And so this is one of those maps that to someone that does not live in Boston does not mean much. But if you know what your neighborhoods, then this tells you, yeah, well, this area, Walsh won this area, makes sense, that's his turf. And Connolly won this area, that makes sense, it's his turf. Really, the votes are, the race is going to be decided by the people in the middle. And this is perhaps a really good way of showing, predicting where candidates should go and canvass. That's all I have. Thank you. I would love to take questions if you have any or not. Yeah.
So that if you go down to block level, you might run into the problems. You would think that there's very few contributions.
Yeah.
On a per block level. So how do you deal with that kind of issue? I mean, there is not much more data there, but aren't you giving us somewhat misleading?
Sure.
But you just say that's what it is.
Yeah, I mean that's what it is.
Okay.
Because one block, if on a really small block, someone gives a lot of money, on the next one it doesn't. Yeah, and that was one of my concerns at the beginning. But I think overall, when you take into account that there's 7,100 blocks, I would hope that those outliers of data get
washed out,
get averaged out. Yeah, and that graphic that I did, the blocks graphic. The nice thing sometimes when I'm doing these election graphics, things like a complaint graphic is. I would say, of course, all these things are important, and I hope I feel that way because that's what I do for a living. But some of them are more important than others. Certainly this one, let me go to it. Whenever you're dealing with elections, election data, it is really important that you not get anything wrong because, that's really bad. Because people are running for office, and it's serious business. And so the nice thing about when I made these graphics, I ran them past one of our study desk reporters, who when he saw these graphics, he's like, oh yeah, that makes sense because of this or this or this, and then he started talking about, well, he lives here, and then there's this other place where and so the data. Fortunately, the data was not lying, but the data was confirming his intuition. So that's always great when data confirms your intuition. If that's not the case, then you should really look at the data again. And that's happened before. Like, you should trust your intuition.
Yeah, I had a question. It looks like well, maybe this is a result of how you presented this, but it takes you several iterations to find a way to tell a story in a way that you like. So, how much exactly? How much work it went into, say, your presidential speeches, presentation, and so forth? Clearly, you're not working all day long on one of these projects, but presumably a few hours every day. So,
Right. I think that is dictated by how much time you have, right? So for the presidential speech, I had several weeks to work on it. So I probably spent about maybe 4 weeks total just working on that, getting familiar with the data, coding, failing, and then finally honing, like nailing down the idea. That's because I had 4 weeks. But sometimes you just have 1 day, so you do the word lab. I think after 2 weeks, the more you're working on it, longer isn't going to yield you anything better. Really important graphics, really important data, or really good data. All you need is a bar chart, because the data is going to. That inaugural address. I mean, what does that really say, right? That's that graphic with the bubbles and all that. I don't know. Yeah, it just depends on how much time you have.
Well, it's really good. I think we haven't even covered taking snapshots of your work. But like you use something called live coding.
Yeah.
Just saw it flashed up on the top of the screen.
Yeah, this is maybe So I wrote this site a long time ago, 2 years ago, and it's something that I use. It's a prototyping tool. So there are 4 tabs here, one for each of these different coding languages. And so the idea is, let me load up something like a chord diagram. The idea is that, so whenever I have an idea for something I want to do, this is a good tool to use, because any changes that you make here are going to instantly be reflected, but also because if you hover over any of these numbers and then hold on the Option key, I think, then you can change the, basically I'm re-rendering the code 100 times every second or something. And so, for example, I look at this code and I think, I don't know what any of this means. There's numbers here. I have no idea what this code does, but let me just start clicking around and then hit this. And okay, so that obviously means that. And so as I click on these magic numbers, you will. I don't know, what's that? 100,000. As I click on these numbers, the code's intentions sort of reveal themselves to me, right? And so this is to me a really useful tool for any prototyping. I can normally, when you do development in the browser, you put in your code editor, then you hit save, you reload the browser. It didn't work. Why didn't it work? But here, you just type, and everything you do is instantly rendered. So this is something that I use quite a bit, and there's many other iterations on this idea. And it's free and open source. Yeah.
So I think what you're doing is fantastic. I really love the fact you can shrink your website. It's like one of my big pet peeves.
Thank you.
With like ESPN or something, major news, like I have a 30-inch monitor and the text is this big, and you have to I hate that. So thank you very much for doing that. But I guess one of my big questions is, how do you sell your boss or your environment on doing a project like this, spending the 2 weeks? Like, what if you do this for them? What value? Why would they pay you to? How trying to convince somebody else to do something like that? What are the main selling points?
That's tough. I mean, I have to me this is a dream job, because I get to play, and then I get, every now and then I get to play and make things like that inaugural speech thing. But then I also get to do really important graphics like the election one that took no time. And fortunately, so far I have not had to convince anyone of what I'm doing. Maybe because I'm hopefully exercising some sort of measure of judgment when not to take it over the top. Before I had this job, I think the best way is to show, right? Just to make things and then show people maybe that, like your potential boss, show them the value of it. At the beginning, before this job, I got this job by just doing things for fun. So one of the things I won't say. I'm not going to speculate on how I got this job, but it's important to when you do things, when you're in this sort of world, to be doing a lot, making, and by doing that, hopefully other people will see that, and they will see the value in that as a communication device, which is what we do. But I mean, that's a really sorry. I just know.
No, it's okay.
Yeah.
So what's your tool chest? I mean, obviously you're using D3 and live coding and stuff like that, but there's a lot of other, it seemed to me, at least looking at the movies you made for each one of those, a lot of other little things going into it. So I was wondering, in terms of your process, when you do one of these movies which goes from point A to point B, throughout the whole prototyping process, thinking process, what are the kind of things you use? How do you go back and forth between the browser and out of it?
I actually, for a while, I was trying to do things with R. If anything, because people at the New York Times use R, and of course they're incredible, and we all aspire to be to do the work they do. I can never remember anything in R after a while. Like, I'll use it, and then 2 weeks later, I've completely forgotten it, because it's just not something that I use outside of R. And so, JavaScript not only is a tool that lets me build websites, but nowadays we have all these incredible frameworks for making charts, making maps, like, a lot. And so I use JavaScript for both the final product and also to iterate an idea. So a lot of people use R and as a data sketching tool. I wish I knew how to do that. I don't. So I just use JavaScript and things like HighCharts, for example, which is a great charting framework that just lets you paste data in there. So HighCharts, for example, whenever I have data that I'm wondering, I have a question about this data, it's a really punctual question, I'll just use this. It's open source. I think it is open source, but you have to pay if you're going to use it for commercial purposes. But there's all these different built-in, out-of-the-box, built-in charts, and the way to and there's, I think you can see new options. Yeah, this is the example of the code, but all you have to really worry about is like this part down here. That's data. All the rest are decorations. This is a great tool. So I use that, but over time it also accumulates snippets of code to reuse. And, the usual JavaScript, HTML.
And for maps?
So
Because there's some pretty sophisticated shapefile type stuff you seem to be under the hood in some of those maps.
yeah, so I think I did that all manually. So I built a bit of code that will tell me where the point is based on its address, like a geocoder, reverse geocoder. And then I built another bit of code that will count number of dots within any given polygon. And then you can give it whatever mesh. You could give it a hexagon mesh, you could give it a squares mesh, anything. And then this code will then tell you, just color it based on a specific value. Yeah.
I have to ask it.
Yeah.
What do you think, as far as the role that librarians can play? Because this is a class for librarians.
Yeah, of course.
Like we were talking about it before, but what do you think are things that librarians can do to help, possibly you in your work, but also just in general? And it also looks like we're doing a horrible job of exploration in our library search systems when you look at how you're exploring this material. So have you ever had an idea of how you want to explore a library catalog?
Oh.
So those are two questions.
Right. Well, I'll go to the one that I can answer because I deal with one of the frustrations that most of us work in. Not all systems are easy to access. Data cityofboston.gov is nice, but Secreta is not without its quirks. So I didn't even mention how I did a map like this. This map was only possible, this map that shows you who won where. The elections department of the city of Boston gave us 29 pages. And so 3 of us that night spent 2 hours, it's a total of 6 hours, just typing in number 27, number for each precinct, like 255 precincts times 12 candidates. Because they just don't want to release digital data. I do not know why. But at least it's a good thing they release the data. But it would be great if they had, in a CSV format or something. I mean, I would say that the less steps to download, the better. So that's the answer to your second question. The answer to the first one, I don't know because I have not worked with that type of data. So like, maybe it's a good time for me to ask, is any of this applicable? And if not, like, what have you, what are you hoping to use the skills in these classes for?
That's one thing is to, one goal is that librarians can help with cleaning data, right? The other side is we're just not doing a good job of describing. So you said that you put a lot of time into coding, right? Or into doing the data entry, right? Attribution, like putting within your the final work what others have done, like a lot of work on to provide you that data is not transferred well, right? In any work that you see, like that someone has done 300 hours of work underneath that.
Oh, I see.
Attribution is a big problem, I think, in academics and just in general, like what they're having trouble with trying to describe who does what, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that's that's one of the other reasons behind the course is that librarians are not doing like describing the work that they're doing well enough to validate their existence, right? So the people that capitalize on that work, do not carry that attribution along, sometimes as much as should be done, right? So that's one of the other reasons behind the course too. I don't think this is on the microphone right now.
Sorry?
I'm not mic'd up, so I don't think people are hearing it.
Okay, did you guys hear all that?
Yeah.
Did you guys hear what he was saying?
No, on the web.
On the webcast,
Yeah.
I think you
Oh,
can
okay.
say.
But that's to give you a background, right? But if you go to our library catalog, it's certainly there are people like Mark in the audience, some that are doing geocoding, right, of some of our material. But it's just you go to a library catalog and it's for searching, right?
Mm-hmm.
But you have all this nice exploratory work through your visualizations that could help with demonstrating, bringing that life.
Right, I don't know.
You think they're different, yeah.
I don't know. I wouldn't say that. I wouldn't say they're different, and not just because I'm so unfamiliar with that. So unfamiliar with. I don't want to. Yeah, I don't know. So the work I do is I try to I look at a data set and I try to distill it to something that will hopefully be memorable to the audience. And I probably fail most of the times, but maybe sometimes I succeed. And maybe that's what it is to take a lot of numbers and make something people remember. Yeah.
I just had a question. So, in all of these, you just sort of were given we want an infographic about the inaugural address or whatever. But do they ever say, we want to make we want you to make this point with your infographic?
No.
So you always get to decide the story? And do you know if that happens, or if that's just
Well, so I would say that certainly at the Globe, I've only been in journalism for 2 years, so I don't. I mean, that when you say that idea of someone asking me make a point, that certainly never happens. We certainly everything I've done and everything I think we try to do is to take ourselves out of, just show you the facts or something. I think what you're asking is, what role do I play in deciding?
Yeah.
So I would say that maybe half the time, like the inaugural speech, all that stuff I did is because I thought it would be fun to do. No one told me, this is something you need to do. Others, on other graphics, some reporter will come and say, have this interesting data set, what do you think? Yeah.
Thanks.
You mentioned how the quiz was really successful or popular.
Yeah.
I was wondering if you could just talk a little bit more about maybe how you knew it was popular, or did you look at the data and figure out maybe why it was popular, how it was used, or anything like that?
I knew it was popular because it got talked about a lot on Twitter.
Oh.
And so I built this thing at the bottom, share your score either on Twitter or Facebook, and then you can click here, and then it will take whatever grade you got and let you tweet it out. And so that day we saw, a lot of these. And so that was one way I knew it. And a lot of these, not by people within the data circle, but just readers. But I did not know it was going to be successful. I hope it would be. Quizzes are a hard thing because there's actually some sites that devote themselves exclusively to quiz making and how to, what question, how to phrase a question. Are you asking something too specific? Like on some of these, I was choosing a question that was not obviously too telling, like something about Kennedy and Cuba, obvious. Right? Even the Lincoln ones with slavery were a bit too obvious, but I think the trick is to respect the reader, and our readers are fairly sophisticated, and so don't treat them like kids, but at the same time, like not all the way too deep.
If you had put Teddy Roosevelt and Richard Nixon, people might have had a really hard time on that one.
I don't know. Yeah. Yes.
You mentioned with the campaign contributions one, it could be used kind of as a canvassing tool.
Sure.
Kind of an analysis.
Sure.
Did you find any candidates actually using your tool and depending on your tool rather than their own analysis?
No, I did not. It's not to say it didn't happen. I don't know. I don't know. That was something I actually, when I saw the map, I wondered. There's something that certainly people could use.
So that specific graphic, is there a reason you didn't sort of maybe resize the polygons or something by the population of a particular precinct? Because it's a little bit not entirely accurate, right? The diagram, because it doesn't necessarily, yeah, the number of votes, because if I have, I mean, are these precincts? I don't know much about how they're divided up. Are they divided up to be equipopulated?
Right. So no, they're not.
They're not, right?
They're. That's also a very good question. All these questions I struggle with. So, I chose precincts because precincts are part of wards, and wards are. I've been told, I've heard that wards are a good proxy for neighborhood. And if you know Boston has Boston neighborhoods, there are no hard lines. So I think a ward is a good way to use a polygon that will help denote sense of place. And so each ward has a number of precincts. But no, I mean, you're right. I mean, maybe it's that this is darker here because there's just a much smaller place and there's a whole lot of votes there. And yeah, there's definitely, I'm sure that this graphic is not, I mean, that's something that it does not take.
But so in a sense, is that more for Walsh or Connolly isn't clear from here, right? I mean, it is because of your mouse over, for sure. But if I was just to look at the Walsh color and the Connolly color, I would not know. I know the relative comparisons of the precincts. That this one had many more, but I don't know like the brightest gray one. How does it compare to the brightest yellow one, or do I?
Oh, I see. Right.
So is this relative?
I see. Ah, that's a good point.
But you do have 0 to 700.
Yeah.
That's interesting. So these must be divided roughly equally then, because what
The
happens if I
precincts?
have 10,000 in one of these and 100 people in the next?
I do not know. I mean, I don't know. These are great questions. Maybe it is the fact that some of these precincts are shaped based on population, because you have really small ones like this one,
Right.
and then really big ones like this one. I don't know.
Gerrymandering.
I don't know.
There's a lot of interesting stuff in this graph. Just put it that way.
Yeah. No,
I'm just wondering where you see this this kind of visualization stuff headed. I mean, like 10 years ago, we didn't have stuff like this, or it wasn't quite at this level. So, do you feel like there's going to be more integration with social media, or new kinds of social media, or is there anything that you see on the horizons that could be valuable
I
to?
don't know. That's a good question. I mean, social media is certainly something that has added a lot. Some of the better, I wouldn't say better. There are some graphics that do a really good job of pulling the reader in. There are graphics out there, for example, that ask you a question. How do you feel about some controversial issue? How do you feel about this? And then they get your input, but then now your input is part of the graph. And after a couple days, the graph has 1,000 points, and it's a scatter plot. And so you're able to consume the data as a reader, but also you're like, oh, that's me right there. That point, that's me. And all these people around me feel the same way. That's so interesting. So there are some graphics that are really good at making you feel like I was here. Like the digital version of I'm here, 1997. But I mean, I don't know, like what's the next thing? I don't think we're doing things that are much different than several years ago, because I mean, Flash. I don't know if you guys remember, Flash was this great tool that was it a couple of years ago, and then it died because Steve Jobs killed it, and then so we had to basically start from zero. I mean, this map, it took me so much work, but it's the simplest map graphically, and yet because of the lack of authoring tools on the web, it takes so long. So I think we're still catching up. I mean, if you look at games right now, on your PlayStation or what have you, any console, they look a million times better than anything we're doing, and yet we put so much more time. So I think one of the next big things will be, hopefully, how to make tools like, how to make things like this easier, because the other thing that I've heard is that people that have the data, like right now, there is such a gap. Like in order to make something like this, you need to know so much, and unnecessarily so. Like there should there's no need. It shouldn't be that you have to know so many different languages and like the way hexagons and shapefiles work, and I don't know. It's just so much, and it's just such a barrier. So maybe one of the next things is just better tools. I certainly hope so. Yes.
Do you archive the data that you use? And if you're looking at something complicated and you're thinking through the data and you have a reasoning that you used, how you use this and why, do you archive that?
I don't archive the data, but I do something that is more or less the same, which is I've started keeping, for every graphic I made, certainly this year, I keep a recipe for how to go from the data all the way to, from the raw data all the way to the data that's going to be consumed by the browser. So for example, in this case, well not this one, because there's no manipulation or massaging of anything. But on this one, for example, there was a lot of cleanup that I had to do, and a lot of some of these things, that not all of them said request for recycling cart. Some of them would have misspellings. These are all categories, and so what I do is make sure to write down instructions in code so that I can take the raw data, put it in, and the code will do all these transformations, and then it will output the final data. And that to me is super useful, because on graphics like these, for example, you notice here it says updated on September 20. I probably ran this graphic 3 or 4 times every time there was new data. And if every time I had to do all the steps manually, I mean, it would be awful. Plus, I'm sure to have introduced an error. That's one of the things that I would say is a real time saver, to create a little bit of a script that will just do all these things for you. So just does it, and then you don't have to worry. And then other people can look at, if someone else has to maintain this graphic, they could just go in and run the recipe, and then they have the right data.
I guess that's the difference between the academic sense, where they have the citations, and they down below you had just a generic citation, but in some way now they're citing the archive data, the data source, right, and linking to it so you can grab the data.
Oh, so I do that
so
here.
You go right there. Okay.
Yeah,
Okay.
This will take you to the OCPF. Oh yeah, I always do that. Whenever I have, if possible, I always do that.
Okay.
Because, I mean, this graphic was only made possible by these great people. So I certainly want to give them credit for their work.
But not the script, though. The script still is the secret sauce.
No, there's no secretness. I mean, the thing about web development is that everything is, like if you just do, yeah, you can look at my code. This is my code. This is, well, part of it. But yeah, everything is open. Yeah.
You mentioned doing scraping for the campaign contributions. What type of web scraping? Did you have any tools that you used, or?
So I ended up I just downloaded all of the data in text file and text format, and then cleaned it up myself after. But there are some great scraper tools out there. So I know there's something called Scraper Wiki. And the Scraper Wiki is a great resource, and I think some other I think it might be like payware, like or what's it, freemium, like depending on how much you use it, they'll ask. But if you're comfortable with code, and it requires very little coding ability, I think. And then if you're familiar with code or Python, there's things like Beautiful Soup, which is something in Python that will help you clean up. I mean, there's so many these days. Thank you.